Hello everyone, I'm Karl Qualls. I'm a professor of history here at Dickinson College. Thanks for joining the webinar. I'm really excited to talk about my new project. My book will be out February 2020. You will see the title in the information you got, and we're going to try to put a link on this video when it's published too, so you can see that at University of Toronto Press. So what I'd like to do for 20 minutes or so is talk about the book project, and if you have questions, go ahead and type those in. I'll see them popping up on the screen, and I'll try to save some time at the end to address as many of those questions as I can. So first of all, Stalin's Niños is a book about a topic that most people know nothing about. It's about 3,000 kids who had to flee the Spanish Civil War because of the bombing and the chaos of Franco and the Italians and the Germans helping him. And their parents sent 30,000 abroad. 3,000 of them ended up in the Soviet Union, and I'm studying their lives in the Soviet Union and the special boarding schools that were created for them. So I wanted to do two things primarily during our time together. First is to just give you an overview of their life during that 14-year period of the boarding schools and all the chaos that ensued during that period. And second, talk specifically about the educational program that the Soviets constructed. That's the main crux of my book, is looking at how and why the Soviets educated them in the way they did. So first, let's start with their time in the Spanish Civil War. So all the children, except for about 70, evacuated starting in April or after April 1937, after the bombing of Guernica. You might know that from the famous Pablo Picasso painting of the same name. The vast majority of them were Basque and Asturian children from the north coast of Spain. They then had to get on rickety ships and sail through very dangerous waters, being tracked by German U-boats through the English Channel and the North Sea up to Leningrad in the Soviet Union. Their stories are absolutely horrific. Of one set of children walking 400 miles from Malaga to Valencia, children of 5 Molinas children. Others enduring bomb shelters and raids before they could leave. One, Ana del Bosque, has one of the most frightening stories. She was on a ship called the Santé, which had an all-Chinese crew, and she'd just seen the famous movie The Mask of Fu Manchu, so she was afraid of anyone who looked like they were Chinese, and so she stayed in the hold of the ship the entire 10-day journey to Leningrad and barely ate anything. It was retching the entire time and watching the rats run around in the hold of the ship. So this is a pretty traumatic experience for all of these children. And I should note that most of these children, almost all of these children, are leftists. They were selected specifically because of the politics of their families. So when they arrive in Leningrad, it's a very different story for them, right? They were coming from primarily impoverished working class backgrounds in a very conservative Spain, even under the democratically elected Republican government. Girls and women had very few opportunities in Spain. And so when they got to the Soviet Union, they didn't know what to make of it. They write letters in the first days after their arrival back to their parents and say things like, gosh, I just didn't know what to expect. I expected snow everywhere, and children going to school on skis. And then they arrive in Leningrad, and they're put up in the best hotel in the entire city, with polished floors that the boys in particular like to go skating up and down and causing trouble on. There's a stuffed bear that scares the heck out of most of them because they've never seen a bear and they think it's alive. They're greeted at the ports as their ship docks by the Red Pioneers. So this is kind of like a Boy Scout and Girl Scout group in the Soviet Union, waving flags, singing the Republican national anthem and the Internationale, bringing them flowers and chocolates and sweets. And they're put up in these hotels and in these former imperial palaces, and fed so much that one boy writes home to his father, I wish I could send you my butter because I've been given so much that I don't like it anymore. And these were kids who were mostly starving through 1936 and 37. They were given white bread, which is a luxury, right? We see that as kind of the junk bread now because we want all the nutrients from the brown bread, but that was a luxury that only the upper class had, and they were being given white bread for the first time. Just absolutely being stuffed with butter and cheese and chocolate. And one kid said it was like arriving in paradise after being in hell. So this was a really dramatic transformation from the traumatic Civil War era in this horrific journey into this kind of loving embrace of the Soviet Union. And a lot of scholars don't ask why this happens. And I think that's the difference in the story I'm telling in my book versus the Spanish scholars in particular who've done this, is they're looking at the memories of this, and they're looking at memoirs that were written sometimes 40, 50, 60 years after the event, and oral histories that didn't start until the late 1980s. I'm looking at the archival record and trying to figure out what the Soviets were trying to do, not necessarily what the Spanish children's memories were in their adulthood. And so the Soviet Union is doing a lot of things with these kids. One is simply humanitarianism, right? They're taking in kids who would most likely die of starvation or in the fog of war. The Soviet Union is the only country to take in a significant number of children and pay for their entire upkeep. Mexico takes a few hundred and pays for them, but the UK, for example, takes 3,000 children and doesn't pay a dime. They refuse to take any children until individuals and organizations and trade unions say that they will foot the bill for them. So the Soviet Union is really an outlier in that way. So it's a humanitarian effort. It's also very much a propagandistic effort, right? Showing that the Soviet Union does something than the democratic capitalist countries who kind of stood aside and let the republic collapse in Spain. It's also about training them to spread socialism, right? Their goal fairly early on is to train these kids to go back and liberate Spain from Franco. So let me talk quickly about the chronology of their life in the Soviet Union and then talk about their education. So the first 2 years, 1937 to 1939, was them just getting settled in this new environment. Yes, they're learning in schools, but mostly they're living kind of a Spanish existence in these schools, boarding schools, so they're set apart for the most part from other Soviet children. And the Spanish Communist Party, which is based in Moscow at this point, is also trying to maintain their Spanish tradition so they can go back and cast Franco and fascism out of Spain. 1939, that all changes. Franco's forces win the Spanish Civil War. The Republican government goes into exile in Moscow, and World War II starts. And so these kids can't go back to Spain. The fear is that the repression that Franco is going to mete out to their parents will be visited on the children as well. And so the Soviet Union and the Spanish Communist Party doesn't want them sent back. So now the Soviet Union has to think about them as long-term residents and eventually citizens for most of them in the Soviet Union. And so that really changes their approach. So they have to start learning the Russian language, much more diligently than they did in the first year. And the educational program changes a little bit, as I'll talk about in a second. 1941 is another big turning point. In June, Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and these children in their boarding schools are evacuated deep into the Soviet interior. So think about this. Within 4 years, these children have been evacuated at least twice. In 37, 38, and then again in 41. And the war is bleak, extremely bleak in the Soviet Union. We have to remember 27 million people died, which is more than all other combatants in World War I and World War II combined. And these children suffered very stark starvation, the brutal cold, living in many parts of Siberia, where they write about their pens freezing, the ink in their pens freezing, and so they can't write. 3 different children in their memoirs corroborate the same story of eating a camel along the Volga River, this blind camel that couldn't find any food anymore, which I think is kind of interesting. And then they basically tore the camel apart and ate it because that's the only meat that they could get. Theft as a matter of survival, not really as hooliganism, simply because it was so hard. Lots of frostbite. Tuberculosis getting worse and worse, and a lot of these kids were coming with massive amounts of disease anyways because they're malnourished in Spain. And so this is by far the worst part of the war of their existence in the Soviet Union was during the war. Many of the older ones volunteer for the Soviet Red Army, and about 300 Spaniards die fighting for the Red Army, oftentimes in guerrilla groups. These aren't all the Niños de la Guerra that come over during the evacuation in 37 and 38, but many of them are. In 1944, they move back to Moscow and begin a much brighter part of their life, where they're lavished with all kinds of resources. Again, they have access to all the museums and shows and everything that Moscow has to offer, and begin to transition, many of them, into higher education to become specialists. As they emerge into their adulthood, which in the Soviet Union usually is at age 14, that's when you end the 7-year schooling process, unless you're going on to higher education, in which you have 3 more years of schooling. Many of them go to work in factories. In the war, this happens for a lot of the older kids as well. And then in the post-war, they go to work in factories, but as I said, they also go to places like Moscow State University, the most prestigious university, and they have massive stipends much higher than their Soviet counterparts. And if we look at the outcomes of this, it's really remarkable. The number of decorated war heroes we have award-winning choreographers, heads of some of the best soccer teams in the Soviet Union, really renowned scientists. So they really make a lot of their lives in the Soviet Union, but then a lot of them make much of their lives going abroad. For example, we have about 24 that end up going to Cuba to help rebuild the new communist country under Che and under Fidel Castro, because they've been trained as engineers and nurses and agronomists and all those things that Cuba needs to start its new revolutionary government. So that's basically their timeline in the Soviet Union. Let me back up and talk about the educational process. What I try to argue in my book, hopefully successfully, is that their education is not that dissimilar than other educational processes we see at the same time. For example, in other modern governments at the same time, we see a process of disciplining youth to use them as resources for the nation, either in labor or as soldiers for upcoming wars. We also see the process of turning them into patriotic citizens. This is going on in the Soviet Union as well. So I want to talk about 2 parts of the education. One is the classroom education, and one is what we might call extracurricular education. They call it vоспитание, kind of an upbringing in the Soviet Union. So in the classroom education, by far the most important part of their upbringing happens in the social sciences, which is devoted to creating what they call patriotism for the 2 homelands. So history, geography, their politics class is all about Soviet history, deeper Russian history, and selected parts of Spanish history, and a lot about heroes that they can emulate. Stories about peasant uprisings in older Spain history. So uprisings against Hannibal, for example, is one part of the Spanish history curriculum that comes in there. The idea of the oppressed coming together and defeating the much more powerful foe. These are the kind of stories that they're learning in both their Russian history classes, but also their Spanish history classes. So this isn't too much different than creating a citizen through education that's going on in Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, Imperial Japan, or even FDR's America, or in the UK or France. These are very similar things that modern educational institutions do. Educational institutions are disciplinary institutions that create the next generation of citizens. What is a little bit more unique is the after-school project, and this is where they really practice their Spanishness. So one part of this is what the Soviets call krужки. So these are kind of like study circles. I'm not sure what we call them in English. They're after school clubs, basically. And you can do anything from model airplane design to ham radio classes to sewing circles and all that kind of stuff. The Spaniards also have Spanish national culture, traditional culture circles where they learn traditional songs, how to sew traditional costumes, do traditional dances, all of those kind of things. And they perform. They perform at the New Year's holidays, anniversary of the Revolution, anniversary of the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, all these kind of things, both within their homes, but also to Soviet audiences. And so there is that education, their education of their Soviet counterparts at the same time. So here they're maintaining their Spanishness in this way in these after-school clubs. At the same time, the Soviet boarding schools are disciplining their time and their bodies, right? They're going to be future workers. They're going to be future soldiers. So it's imperative, especially some of these boarding schools having 400 or so students, that there's a lot of time discipline, that they get from point A to point B on time. We can start class. They have respect for their teachers and for all elders. They have a sense of hygiene, right, with 400 kids in one place. And again, these kids coming from very humble, impoverished backgrounds, things like basic washing of self, clothes, and linens to prevent all kinds of communicable diseases. All this is part of that disciplinary process in these extracurricular clubs and activities. Part of the disciplining is also disciplining the mind. Like, how do you become Soviet? Becoming Soviet is about kind of a hygienic body, hygienic surrounding. That's how you were modern in the Soviet sense. So they're teaching that in these extracurricular clubs. But they're also teaching things like comradeship, like working for others, self-sacrifice, collective activity, kind of moving beyond yourself. Part of that is also teaching them internationalism, and that is very specifically to counteract the upswing in nationalism that we've seen between the two world wars and after, right? Whether it be the democratic governments or the fascist governments in Europe becoming very ultra-nationalist countries. The Soviet Union and the communist parties more broadly are actively fighting that, and so trying to teach these kids about internationalism, that all workers are the same regardless of where they come from. Another part of that is secularism. These kids are growing up in a very, very Catholic country in Spain, where even the Basque Communist Party is Catholic, which makes no sense to the Soviet Communist Party. They don't understand how you can be a Marxist and be Catholic or religious at the same time. So retraining them, right, and telling them about how the Catholic Party for centuries and currently in Spain at that time is repressing women, is supporting the large señores, the large landowners, and suppressing the peasant and the working class, and showing them the opportunities, particularly for girls and women in the Soviet Union that couldn't have at home. There's one girl that writes this letter, and she's just astounded when she sees a tram driver who's a woman, and she writes back, "Someday I'm going to be a pilot." Her father happened to be a pilot too, because she saw all these possibilities. Right, women were in professions in the Soviet Union in ways that they couldn't be in Spain. And so it really opened up a lot of avenues. And so that's part of training them to be Soviet, is to have these kind of mentalities and behaviors and ways of life. And after 1939, this becomes really imperative, so they can begin to emerge in their adulthood into the Soviet society more broadly, without as much support from either the Spanish Communist Party or Soviet institutions. So these two types of classroom education and outside of classroom education, I argue, is quite consistent with a Soviet practice that other scholars of these Niños have not recognized, because they're looking at them as Spaniards, not as Soviets. There's a very particular type of education in the Soviet Union at this time called non-Russian Soviet schools. So these are schools for Soviet children who are not from Russian-speaking families. So they might be Uzbek or Georgians or Buryats or something like that. And so the policy, which Stalin again and again reinforces, is that these children should learn in their native tongue, and that Russian should only be taught as a second language. So all their mathematics, their politics, their history, everything should be happening in their native tongue, and then Russian as a second language. Guess how these children are being taught, right? As soon as they come to the Soviet Union, Soviet textbooks are translated into Castilian Spanish, right? Which I always have to wonder, right, what this means to the Basque speakers in the group. And the Basque are the largest group, but many of them are probably already speaking Castilian Spanish anyway. So it's translated into their native tongue, and they learn Russian on the side. After 1931, and particularly after 1941, as the war starts, more and more Russian becomes the lingua franca in the schools. So they're learning more of their core curriculum in Russian and not just in the Russian classes. And this shows me that the Soviet Union very consciously understands that they're going to have to make this bridge into Soviet society, so they need to learn the language. And one of the things we see in the archives from factory bosses as they emerge, 14, 15, 16 years old and go into factory work, is they can't do the work. They don't know how to read the manuals for any machines they might be working. They can't understand orders from their managers and supervisors, and so that trickles back into the school, and we see then a re-emphasis during the war years on really teaching them Russian in a much more meaningful and sustained way so that they can integrate. And this is successful, and we can tell this by the number of them that goes to the best universities and trade schools in the Soviet Union. The younger group that has longer time in these boarding schools and more access to Russian language training make this more seamless transition into being what I call Hispano-Soviet adults. So they have their Spanish culture, but they have these Soviet ways, including the Russian language, that allows them to merge into Soviet society. Another indicator of this is the number of now men and women that marry Soviet citizens and not Spanish children, former Spanish Niños de guerra. In fact, the boarding school process is so nurturing that they call these their homes. They call the other kids that grew up in their homes as their family. And several of them, another scholar who's done some oral histories, has shown that they actually had a disdain for niños from the same school who later on in life married each other, and saw it as kind of a quasi-incestuous relationship because that was their family. And so in a lot of ways, the marriage to a Soviet citizen was seen as more proper and maybe even more ethical than marrying another Spaniard from their same home. We have a lot of Spaniard and Spaniard relationships and marriages as well, but a lot of intermarriage within different Soviet populations too. Right. So what have I? So one last thing before I get to some conclusions is how do these kids learn these Soviet traits? These kids don't realize it initially until their evacuation in the war, but they're a very, very privileged group. The amount of spending per capita on the Spanish refugee children is far higher than that for Soviet children. They're taken on excursions to museums and plays and symphonies and the zoo and parks that Soviet children don't have either as frequently or don't have at all. Sometimes this is just for the entire class to go and see this new play that's being put on, right? So they're going to see the Bolshoi for free, right? The best dancers, the best musicians in the world, these kids would have never had access to that in Spain. Some of those actors and musicians, including the conductor of the Bolshoi symphony, actually comes to the home and gives one of the kids private harmony lessons. Right, so they're really, really privileged in these ways of getting to have all these experiences and seeing what Soviet society has. And in this case, showing that it doesn't matter what your social class is, your economic status is, the arts and the aesthetics is a part of your learning. And in fact, the Soviets pushed that much more than the Spanish Communist Party. The leader, Dolores Ibarruri, also known as the Passion Flower, she goes to the schools at one point, and a little girl has her nails painted. And she just starts haranguing this little girl, saying that a girl of the revolution doesn't paint her nails, she has calluses on her hands. Right? They wanted them to be workers and engineers and things like that. And we're actually trying to shift kids away from being things like choreographers and musicians and things like that, because that didn't have a place in the new post-Franco Spain that needed to modernize. So the Soviets were giving them the aesthetic that was part of your upbringing in the Soviet Union, even though the Spanish Communist Party wasn't that thrilled with it. So excursions are a really big part of that. These study circles that I talked about, and then also a series of films that the kids see that are almost identical to the ones that Soviet children would see, that teach notions of heroism. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a good child? What does it mean to be a good a child to your parents, but what does it also mean to be a good child as a citizen? And a lot of those lessons are learned through film and learned through literature. And they have these viewing parties, if you will, where they will watch a film, and then the kids are given assignments in teams to write up a review for it in the newspaper or to adapt it themselves in some way. And so they're learning to internalize these messages of the Soviet Union through the arts, through visits to all of these different environments throughout Moscow and what have you. Right, so I haven't seen any questions yet. Bring those questions in while I finish up here. So I talked a little bit about their adult lives, right? A lot of award-winning scientists, musicians, soccer players, all that. A lot of just kind of average workers as well. So what happens after they leave these schools when they close in 1951? And they close simply because there aren't enough young children to make them viable anymore. We see some of these Spaniards return to Spain. The first mass movement of these Niños de la Guerra back to Spain happens in the mid-1950s. But about half of them also returned to the Soviet Union within a year. And this shows me that they have internalized this notion of Hispano-Soviet. So you're Spanish in culture, right? The form of your expression of national identity, but the content of your thinking and behavior is Soviet. And that content being secularism, internationalism, anti-fascist, this just does not sit well in mid-1950s. Franco is still in power, actually still in power for another 20 years, still repressing the left from which these children come. And especially the former girls, right, the now adult women, just don't see any opportunity in Spain, right? They want to go back to the Soviet Union and live out a full life. Those that do stay in Spain, some of them are repressed. Many of them begin to start forming networks of association, especially after Franco dies in 1975. It's kind of a mutual aid societies. So they begin to have very divergent lives. Those who stay in Spain, or excuse me, stay in the Soviet Union, those who go to Spain, those who go to other countries, joining their parents in France or in Mexico, for example, is something that many of them do. But this experience they had, I think the way that the Soviets raised them of having those two different types of patriotisms, those two different allegiances, allows them to live in the Soviet Union quite easily because they have the language, they have the traditions, they have all those things, but actually doesn't allow them to go home because the way they think, what they value in life is so fundamentally different than this kind of radical conservatism of Franco that they just can't bear it. And so if they don't want to stay in the Soviet Union, which many of them don't, they end up going to another Spanish-speaking country. All right, sometimes helping to spread the word of socialism, some to just live a normal life somewhere. Okay, so I'll wrap that up. I see a couple of former students coming on the line. I do want to let you know that the book is going to be coming out in February 2020. We'll have a link on this video when it's published. There will be additional for those who get the ebook. I have a student with me, and Alexia's parents are supposed to be watching right now. Hi. She is making a bunch of maps for me right now. We found data of all the Spaniards who died in the Soviet Union, mostly during the war years, and she's using her data manipulation skills to take that raw data and make them into visual maps. And so we'll have some maps. I'm creating a bunch of charts and graphs and a lot of photos from the Spanish archives that I'll be populating that simply are too expensive to put in a book. So I wanted Toronto to make a book that people could afford. I think it's still under 40 bucks right now. We'll see what it is when it actually comes out in February. All right, so I'm going to try to answer some of these questions. I'll take them in order. Hi, Claire. Right. So one of my former students, Claire, is on the line. She says, do we know if these children kept ties to their Catholic faith despite what the Soviets were telling them, or is there no record or evidence of that? So we don't have any record or evidence that they kept it. We do have evidence of what the Soviets did to try to quash that quite easily. We have one girl who wrote about this otherwise positive reception into the Soviet Union, right, with the chocolates and the bears and the hotels and everything, saying how traumatized she was for a couple of reasons. One was because they immediately took the Spanish, or excuse me, her family Bible away from her and threw it away. They also took away this fancy, what do we call it, nido de abajo in Spanish. I'm trying to think of what that translates to in English. I can't think of the word right now, but a kind of a fancy dress, and just gave her the same uniform that all the other kids wore. She was from a slightly higher socioeconomic group, and so she was just appalled by this. So they quickly realized that, at least publicly, maintaining the religion is simply unacceptable. And in fact, that's one of the things that gets some of the Spanish adults purged from the homes in 1939, 1940. As Spanish Republicans flee Spain in 1939, they come to the Soviet Union, and many of them end up as teachers and cooks and things like that in the schools. Many of them are dismissed in 1939, when the notion of an ideal role model is more important. And one of the things that can get you dismissed, for example, one guy was trained in a seminary. He's out. He was also charged with having sexual relations with the girls in the school. We don't know which one of those came first, but somebody is definitely trying to get him removed with these two charges. There's also a Spanish woman in the school, very similarly, who's apparently by the charges a bad worker, but she also is having sexual relationships with the boys. We don't see any of these kind of charges against the Soviets, just against the Spaniards. So thank you, Claire. Andre Dominguez is on the line. Andre was one of my first student workers on this, helping me to amass a bibliography. She gets a shout out in the introduction of the book. So there you have it. She asks, have you been able to follow up any of their descendants? Are there any interesting stories? So no, that's not something I have done. The oral history, so the Spanish scholars have done tremendous oral histories, but we don't have really good longitudinal, like what happens to their children and grandchildren. We do know more about those that stayed in the Soviet Union. Many of them begin to attend a center that is established in Moscow, dedicated to the descendants of these children, so they can continue to learn Spanish, how to dance flamenco, what their local foods might have been had they been raised in Spain. We don't have any good longitudinal studies to see what became of these. My assumption is that their educational levels, second and third generation, are going to be much higher than, say, their cousins or what have you that remained in Spain. But that's just an assumption. We don't, to my knowledge, have any evidence of that. Christine Baxi asks, very quickly, because I'm getting the 1 minute, why privilege the Spanish children over the native Russian children? What's the overall motive? So I think some of this is the propaganda motive of this. Some of this is also an alert to other Spanish communist parties throughout the world that the Soviet Union is willing to do this for non-enemy peoples, right? So the Polish and the Germans, they are treated miserably, but the Spanish are all right. And I think, again, I don't have the evidence for this, but I hope some scholar picks it up, that this is the beginning of what will become a much larger process of educating international communist children in the Soviet Union, and eventually a university, primarily for developing world students in Africa, Asia, and to some degree Latin America. Let me see if I can get another question in here. Louise Lally asked two. Maybe this is Erica's mom, I don't know. Are there present-day communities descendants of the Hispano-Russians that returned to Spain, or has this notion of Hispano-Russian disappeared? Absolutely there are. Primarily in and around Madrid. They're small simply because of their age. Most of them are in their 80s or 90s. And there is a community in Moscow still too, but it's really, really small too. How many of these children are still alive? Don't know. As of a couple years ago, there's still a couple hundred in Moscow. I'm guessing just by their age that there's probably not more than 500 to 700 of these, roughly 3,000 still alive. And lastly, Vivian Green, if the Soviet Union was raising the Niños de la Guerra with Soviet ideals while maintaining the Spanish identity, how did this affect the Niños de la Guerra when they went back to Spain, if they did? Right, so this was a very difficult transition. I had this one wonderful story. They're so privileged when they leave the Soviet Union. They're taking all these material goods back to Spain in the mid-50s, including one guy brings back a television set, and there's not television in Spain. And so he don't know what to do with it. They bring refrigerators and even cars back. This actually gets them in trouble with their families who are much poorer, don't have access, and they think these former exile refugee children are kind of putting on airs when they just don't realize how desperately poor most of their families are in Spain. So I think that is the last one, so I'm going to have to leave it at that. Thank you for joining me. Please let me know, QUALLSK@dickinson.edu. If you have further questions, I'll be happy to answer that. This will be going up on the Dickinson website, and I'll put it up on my YouTube channel in the coming days. And the book will be out, I hope, February 2020. All right. Thank you for joining us. Go Devils.